Minutes right after my divorce was finalized, I called my dad. Fire all 27 employees my in-laws planted in the company. Thank God I did, because that same evening, my MIL came over yelling, demanding me to take it back. That's what she wanted. Take back a phone call I had been planning for 2 years, rehearsing in my head during grocery runs and red lights and the long stretch of insomnia that had become my nightly companion, until I could say the words in my sleep, and probably had some nights, judging by the way I'd wake up with my jaw already clenched around them. She stood in my hallway that evening in pearls and a coat that cost more than my monthly rent, and she wanted me to undo something that had already happened 3 hours earlier, in a conference room she had no idea existed, to 27 people whose names I could recite in my sleep by then too. I want to tell you how we got here, because if I just hand you the ending, you will think this was impulsive. You will think I woke up one Thursday morning and decided to detonate 2 families over breakfast. That is not what happened. What happened took 2 years, and most of it happened in silence, in spreadsheets, in a kitchen at midnight with cold tea going colder, while I smiled at dinners I did not want to attend and signed my name to things I did not fully believe. For now, what matters is that I am the daughter of a man who built something real with his hands and his stubbornness, and I married into a family that had spent 2 generations learning how to take real things apart quietly enough that nobody noticed until it was too late to stop them. I noticed. It just took me 2 years to be able to prove it in a way nobody could argue with. My dad started his company out of a rented storage unit the year I turned 6. I know this the way children know the founding myths of their own families, half from memory and half from having heard the story told so many times at holiday tables that the telling itself became a kind of memory. He had a truck that needed coaxing to start in the cold, a business loan he almost didn't get approved for because the loan officer took one look at his handwriting on the application and asked if he had someone who could help him with the paperwork, and a stubbornness that I did not understand as a virtue until I was old enough to need it myself. By the time I was in high school, the storage unit was a real building with his name on a sign out front, and by the time I finished college, that building had grown twice, added a second bay, then a third, until the company employed close to 200 people and fed, by my dad's own way of counting things, close to 200 families. He knew names, not just the names of his managers, but the names of the guys on the floor, their kids, whose wife was going through chemo, whose son had just made varsity. He was the kind of boss who remembered your anniversary before you did, and who occasionally got taken advantage of because of it, though nobody in the building would have said that to his face, and for a long time neither would I. He trusted people the way honest men trust people, which is to say completely, and usually faster than the situation warranted. It was his best quality, and it was eventually the crack in the foundation that let 2 entire families move in without him ever hearing them unpack. I studied business in college and took an internship in compliance the summer after my junior year, because I had already noticed, even at 20, that my dad's biggest blind spot was the paperwork he signed too quickly and the people he trusted too fast. Somebody in that family needed to be the person who read the fine print. I decided, without ever formally deciding, that it would be me. What I did not know yet, could not have known yet, was that the fine print I would eventually need to read most carefully would not be in a vendor contract or a supplier agreement. It would be in the guest list at my own wedding. I met the man who would become my husband at a charity dinner his mother had organized, a kind of event where the centerpieces cost more than most people's monthly car payment, and everyone talks about their summer plans like summer is a competitive sport. He was 30 then, handsome in the specific way that seems to apologize for itself, which I have since learned is the most effective kind of handsome there is, because it disarms you before you even realize you needed disarming. He remembered my coffee order after our first date. He asked questions and then actually seemed to listen to the answers, which felt so rare at the time that I mistook it for depth. His mother, I will call her by the role she occupied rather than a name, because the role is what matters here, ran her household and her social circle the way some people run a small country. She knew the first and last names of everyone who mattered within a 50-mile radius, plus their spouses, plus their children's schools. Plus, I would later understand exactly how much debt or leverage sat quietly behind each of those polished names. She wore the kind of warmth that felt in the moment like being chosen, and only later revealed itself as something closer to being assessed. The first time I visited their house, I noticed the window frames were soft with rot underneath a fresh coat of white paint. I did not have the vocabulary for what that meant yet. Old money running thin, appearances outlasting the actual money by a decade or two, but I had the feeling, the specific unease of a person whose job would eventually be reading contracts, noticing that something about the presentation did not match the substance underneath it. At dinner that first visit, she asked what I did, and I told her I managed contracts and compliance for my father's mechanical contracting firm. She set down her fork, looked at me the way you look at someone who has just answered a question correctly on a test they did not know they were taking, and said, "Practical. That's exactly what this family needs." Everyone at the table laughed warmly. I laughed too because it sounded like a compliment, and because I was 26 and in love and had not yet learned to hear the second meaning underneath the first one. It would take me the better part of a decade to understand I had not been offered a compliment that night. I had been offered a job. He proposed the following spring at a restaurant his mother had chosen, and I said yes with my whole heart, which is the one detail in this entire story I would change if I could change only one thing. We married with 200 guests, most of whom I had never met before that day, and at the reception, his mother stood with a champagne glass in her hand and gave a toast that ended with the words, "Family takes care of family." The room applauded. My dad wiped his eyes. I squeezed my new husband's hand under the table and believed completely that I was the luckiest woman in the room. 6 weeks later, she called me directly for the first time, not my husband, me, to ask whether my dad's company might have an opening in purchasing for a cousin who was, in her words, between opportunities and so good with numbers. I passed the resume along myself with a note attached that said family referral, full disclosure, and felt almost virtuous about the disclosure part, as though writing the words down made the arrangement transparent rather than simply documented. I signed the welcome packet myself because new hire paperwork ran through my desk in those early years, and remember thinking how nice it was that our two families were knitting together, threads pulling closer, nothing that couldn't be explained by ordinary family warmth. I still think about that signature, not with guilt exactly. Guilt implies I understood what I was doing at the time, and I did not. I think about it with a specific queasiness of a woman who watched herself hold a door open and say welcome, so glad you're here, to the first draft of something that would take 2 years and a forensic level of documentation to finally close. The cousin in purchasing was, in retrospect, a test balloon, though I did not understand that at the time and would not understand it for years. He interviewed fine. He got hired on his own modest merits, showed up on time, did nothing remarkable in either direction, which I have since come to understand is exactly what a test balloon is supposed to do. Nobody sends the real cargo up first. You send something small and harmless to see if anyone in the tower is watching the sky. Nobody was watching, or rather I was watching, but I did not yet know what I was looking at, and everyone around me had a vested interest in making sure I never found out. That Christmas, my mother-in-law gave my dad a bottle of scotch older than I was and told him that his company was exactly the kind of story her family was proud to be part of now. My dad glowed. I glowed. I would eventually calculate years later, sitting at my kitchen table with a legal pad and a red pen, that the scotch had cost her something in the neighborhood of 1/1000th of what that sentence, family takes care of family, was about to make her over the following decade. Between the first year of our marriage and the fourth, the hires kept coming. 1 or 2 a year at first, spaced out enough that no single hire looked like part of anything, each one arriving with its own small, plausible story. A friend's daughter needed a foot in the door in human resources, sweet girl just graduated, would it hurt to give her a chance? A cousin's husband had experience in logistics, and the operations team could always use another set of hands. Someone's son-in-law, someone I had met exactly once at a holiday party, turned out to have exactly the kind of estimating background the company happened to need that quarter, according to my husband, who vouched for him with the easy confidence of a man repeating something he had been told rather than something he actually knew. I want to be fair here because fairness matters to me even now. Not every hire that came through that door was a bad one. Some worked hard and earned their paychecks honestly, on their own merits, at any company, with any last name. This is not a story about resenting everyone connected to my husband's family. It is about the ones who did not earn their spot, whose entire function was to exist inside my father's company as a kind of soft tissue, present, employed, drawing a paycheck, doing very little that could not have been done by nobody at all. I did not understand the distinction clearly at first because pattern recognition takes time, especially when the person doing the recognizing has every emotional incentive not to see what she is looking at. I loved my husband. I wanted, more than almost anything, for the family I had married into to be exactly what it appeared to be at the wedding: generous, close-knit, fundamentally decent underneath the pearls. It took me nearly 3 years to stop wanting that badly enough to look clearly instead. The acceleration happened, as these things so often do, during a crisis, when everyone's attention was pointed somewhere else, and the people who knew how to move quietly had the widest possible door standing open in front of them. My dad had a heart attack on the shop floor the September I turned 30. He went down between 2 rows of racked pipe stock, and a 23-year-old apprentice who had been on the job less than a year performed chest compressions until the ambulance arrived, a fact that still makes my throat tighten when I think about it. Triple bypass. He survived. I need to say that clearly and immediately because I do not want to make you carry that fear any longer than necessary. He lived. But he was out of the building for the better part of 8 months, and the building noticed his absence the way a body notices a missing organ. First with confusion, then with adaptation, then with something that started to look uncomfortably like acceptance. I spent that fall and winter splitting my time between a hospital room in Columbus and an office in the town where the company was headquartered, and I made a choice during those months that I have never once regretted, though I have paid for it in ways I am still tallying. I chose my father's heartbeat over the org chart. I chose sitting beside his bed, holding his hand while machines beeped their steady reassurances, over sitting in a conference room watching who got hired while nobody with real authority was watching. While I was choosing that, my husband's younger brother, a man whose previous job title I have never, to this day, been able to pin down with any confidence, volunteered to help out temporarily at the company. Temporary became a desk. The desk became a title, operations director, a role that had not existed the month before. My husband began introducing his brother to our municipal contacts, walking him through relationships that had taken my father 15 years to build, with the easy confidence of a man who believed those relationships were simply part of the family inheritance now. The hiring, which I had been watching with at least some vigilance before my father's collapse, happened almost entirely while I was in a cardiac ward holding my mother's hand and trying to remember how to breathe normally. 16 people came aboard in those 8 months. 16. I did not learn the full number until much later, when I finally sat down with payroll records and hire dates and built the document that would eventually change everything. But even without the precise count, I could feel something had shifted the moment I walked back into that building for the first time since my father's collapse. When my dad finally returned to work, thinner, slower, moving through hallways with the careful deliberation of a man whose chest had recently been and opened and closed again. He looked at the new organizational chart taped to the wall of the main conference room and said it was nice to see so much fresh energy in the building. I looked at the same chart and saw something closer to a transplant the body had not yet had the chance to approve or reject. Tissue grafted on during the one window when the immune system was too busy fighting for survival to notice what else was moving in. I did not have proof of anything concrete yet. Not really. Not the kind of proof that could survive an argument in a room full of people with a vested interest in disbelieving me. What I had, at that point, was a feeling, and the beginning of an idea about how to turn that feeling into something nobody could argue with. One night, unable to sleep, which by that point in my marriage had become less an occasional occurrence, and more a kind of chronic condition I had learned to live inside, I sat down at my kitchen table with a legal pad and started drawing the company from memory. Every hire since my wedding, every referral line, traced back to its source, every reporting relationship, official and unofficial, the ones on the org chart and the ones that only existed in practice, in who actually called whom when a decision needed to get made quietly. Then I got a red pen and circled every single person on that page connected to my husband's family by blood, by marriage, or by the kind of social proximity that functions exactly like blood once money and favors start moving through it. Tennis partners, country club acquaintances, people whose children had grown up alongside my husband's children from a previous life I knew almost nothing about. When I finished, I counted the circles. Then I counted them again, because I did not believe the number the first time. The way you sometimes recount money you are certain you miscounted simply because the total feels too large to be accurate. 27. 27 people sitting inside, purchasing, accounts payable, estimating, human resources and operations, spread across departments in a way that, if you understand how money actually leaves a company, is not a random distribution. It is a supply chain. It is architecture. Nobody accidentally places 27 relatives and referrals across exactly the 5 departments that touch every dollar coming in or going out, even if every individual hire could be defended in isolation as a small, reasonable favor. I brought the legal pad to my father's office the next morning, before the building had fully woken up. He studied it for a long minute, longer than I expected, and I watched something flicker across his face I could not fully name at the time, though I understand it much better now. He is not a stupid man, my father. He built an entire company out of a storage unit through sheer force of pattern recognition applied to steel and copper and municipal contracts. But he is a loyal man, and loyalty and intelligence are not the same faculty, and sometimes they actively work against each other, the way a strong immune system can occasionally attack the very body it is meant to protect. They are good people, he said, sliding the pad back across the desk toward me. Her people are good people. You don't fire family. He meant it, in that moment, as a principle. The same kind of principle that had let him build a company where employees stayed for decades and felt genuinely cared for. What I did not fully understand yet was that my mother-in-law had spent the better part of 6 years transforming that principle from something he believed into something that functioned, in practice, exactly like a password. A phrase that, once spoken, closed every door I tried to open. I took my legal pad and went back to my own office and did the only things I had the actual authority to do without his signature. I tightened approval thresholds across several departments. I required dual sign-off on any new vendor above a certain dollar amount. I quietly flagged my own access to every purchasing record in the system, visibility I technically already should have had but had never bothered to claim before, because before that morning I had never imagined I would need it. It felt at the time like sandbagging a house before a storm everyone else insisted was nothing but sunshine. 2 months later, I found purchase order 7734, and nothing about my life stayed quiet again for a very long time. It was January, and I was doing the least dramatic task imaginable, reconciling quarterly budgets against published commodity indexes. Copper had dipped that quarter, a meaningful dip that should have shown up in our own cost of materials. Ours had not moved. I ran the numbers 3 times, then pulled 2 full years of invoices from our primary pipe and fitting supplier. We had been paying on average 22% above market rate for materials we ordered constantly, in volumes large enough that 22% was not a rounding error. On a category that size, over that many years, it was the equivalent of a second mortgage the company was quietly paying every year without anyone upstairs noticing, or perhaps without certain people upstairs wanting anyone to notice. A bad price alone is not proof of a crime. Sometimes it is simply a lazy buyer, or an old relationship nobody has bothered to rebid. So I looked into the vendor itself. What I found was a company barely 5 years old, added to our approved vendor list during the exact 8-month window my father was recovering from surgery, approved with a single signature belonging to my husband's brother, the same one whose temporary desk had quietly become permanent that same year. The company's listed address turned out to be a small office suite in a business park, which for a company supposedly distributing industrial pipe and fittings at scale, struck me the way it would strike anyone with even passing familiarity with how physical goods actually move through the world. You do not distribute pipe fittings out of a shared office suite with a parking lot built for sedans rather than delivery trucks. The company's website consisted of 3 pages of stock photography, one image of which still carried the faint, barely visible watermark of the forklift rental company the photo had originally been licensed from. I sat with all of that for a long, careful evening, and I made a decision that would define the next 2 years of my life. I did not call anyone. I did not march into my husband's office, or my father's, or my mother-in-law's carefully arranged living room and announce what I had found. I had already learned once before in a smaller way what happens when I raise a pattern out loud in a a room full of people who have every reason not to want that pattern seen. I had flagged an earlier vendor contract that looked inflated months before in a leadership meeting and been gently, warmly, almost affectionately dismissed. She reads warranty cards for pleasure, someone had said, and the room had laughed. And I had laughed too, because that had become my brand by then, the careful one, the worrier. It made anything I said sound like anxiety rather than evidence, no matter how carefully I said it. This time I decided I would count every single brick before I ever said the word wall out loud to anyone at all. For close to 2 years after that evening, with the invoices spread across my dining table, I lived a kind of double existence I would not wish on anyone, and that I am still, in certain quiet moments, surprised I managed to sustain without cracking entirely. By day, and often well into the night, I copied invoices during lunch breaks at my own job. I screenshotted approval chains at midnight, at 1 in the morning, at whatever hour insomnia delivered me back to consciousness, with my mind already circling the same numbers. I cross-referenced payroll records against actual project assignments, building, line by line, a spreadsheet that grew from a single tab into 3, then 7, then a document so large it had its own summary page, tracking exactly how much money left my father's company every month through people who existed, on paper, to help it grow, and who, in practice, drew salaries that bore very little relationship to any work I could find evidence of them actually doing. The number, once I had enough months of data to trust it, was not small. It was the kind of number that does not just describe a financial problem. It redraws the whole shape of what you thought a family was. I want to try to describe what that period actually felt like from the inside, because from the outside it probably looks clinical, a woman quietly building a case the way a prosecutor builds one. It was not that. Every invoice I photographed, every approval chain I screenshotted, I was doing it with my husband asleep 2 rooms away, a man I still loved, or still wanted to love. Every number I entered into that spreadsheet was also, quietly, a number I was entering into the ledger of my own marriage, though I did not let myself think of it in those terms for a long time, because thinking of it that way would have meant admitting something I was not ready to admit. My marriage was already dying by the time I finished building the full spreadsheet, and in a strange way, that timing felt almost merciful, because it meant I never had to consciously choose between loyalty to my husband and loyalty to my father. The marriage did that arithmetic for me, but even once I understood the marriage itself was functionally over, I could not act on any of what I had found. My lawyer, once I finally hired one, was blunt with me the very first time I brought it up. "If you touch anything at that company while this divorce is active," she said, "it reads as sabotage. It reads as a woman burning down her soon-to-be ex-husband's family business out of spite, and it will follow you into every single negotiation in this case, no matter how carefully documented your evidence actually is. Every true thing you say after that point gets read as strategy rather than fact. Sit on it. Wait for the decree." I sat on 2 years of proof, and I smiled at family dinners I did not want to attend, married to a man I no longer wanted to be married to, watching 27 people continue to collect paychecks that should, by any reasonable accounting, have gone toward growing my father's actual business instead of quietly draining it from the inside. Somewhere around the 18-month mark of the divorce proceedings, I hired a forensic accountant, paying her out of my own savings, money I had originally set aside as a down payment on a house I no longer needed to buy. She spent weeks reconstructing what my own spreadsheet had already told me in rougher form. Every invoice, every questionable purchase order, every receiving log signed with the same tight, familiar initials, until her report grew into something closer to 80 pages, the kind of document that makes even the person who commissioned it go quiet when she finally reads the total out loud on a phone call. But it was something else entirely, something I nearly missed despite months of careful reading, that ended up reorganizing my entire calendar and turning the last stretch of the divorce into something closer to a countdown, buried in my own contract files, in language I had personally reviewed years earlier and apparently absorbed without fully registering its significance, was a renewal clause attached to the master supply agreement with the vendor I had first flagged 2 years before. Automatic renewal, 5-year term, renewing itself silently unless formally canceled in writing at least 30 days before the expiration date. I checked the expiration date, then I checked it again, the way you check something twice, not because you doubt the arithmetic, but because you are hoping, against all available evidence, that you have somehow misread it. The cancellation deadline fell in late June. My divorce was scheduled to finalize in the middle of that same month. Once I understood what that overlap actually meant, the entire 15 months of delays that had characterized the divorce, the continuances, the sudden change of attorneys that reset discovery by 90 days, the settlement conferences that dragged on over furniture and details that felt almost deliberately trivial, looked completely different to me, like a photograph slowly developing in reverse. Every delay had shuffled the finish line further to the right, closer and closer to a very narrow window in late June. The decree would land roughly 2 days before the final legal opportunity to cancel that contract. 2 days. They had not been stalling the divorce out of simple stubbornness or greed or even ordinary negotiating strategy about the financial settlement. They had been running out the clock on a contract worth, by that point, millions of dollars over its remaining term, betting that a newly divorced woman with boxes to unpack and an entire life to rebuild would not turn around within 48 hours and start a corporate war. It was, I will admit even now, a reasonable bet. I called my lawyer and told her about the clause, and there was a silence on the line that I can only describe as respectful, the particular quiet of a professional recognizing a genuinely dangerous move when she finally sees the whole board laid out in front of her. "Then we do not slip a single day," she said, "and they They will expect you to be exhausted when this is finally over. I looked at the wall of my apartment, at the stack of index cards I had taped up in roughly chronological order, at the spreadsheet summary page I had pinned in the center like a keystone holding the entire arch together, and I felt something I had not felt in close to 2 years. Not dread, not even anger exactly, though anger was certainly present somewhere underneath it. What I felt, more than anything else, was schedule. They believed they were running out my clock. They had no idea I had already synchronized my own watch to theirs months earlier, without them ever noticing I was paying attention to the time. I need to tell you about the week I almost let all of it go, because I think it is the most honest part of this entire story. The part where I look the least like someone building toward a phone call that would eventually end with security walking 27 people out of a building in a single afternoon. About 5 weeks before the trial date, my husband's mother made her move, and I will say even now, even knowing everything I know about her, that it was beautifully constructed. It arrived dressed as peace rather than as strategy, which is the most dangerous way any offer can arrive. Through my husband's attorney, someone proposed a kind of family mediation, not the legal kind, but something softer. Tea and reconciliation. His mother presiding, and folded gently inside that proposal was the actual offer underneath it. The family would withdraw their demand for a full revaluation of my father's company as a marital asset, a demand that had been hanging over the entire proceeding like whether nobody could quite escape if I would agree, in writing, to a comprehensive confidentiality agreement covering all family and business matters going forward. Read that again the way I made myself read it that week, because it took me several passes before I understood exactly what was being offered. They would stop pretending they deserved any claim on my father's company, in exchange for my permanent silence about the actual reason they did not deserve one. My lawyer, when I brought it to her, called it exhaustion, both theirs and mine, a recognition on their side that the war was becoming expensive and uncertain, and a genuine hope on my side, one I could not fully deny even to myself, that maybe I was simply tired enough to take the easy exit being offered to me. For about a week, I actually sat with it seriously. I drafted an email accepting the terms, and I want to be honest about how far I let that draft go. It sat in my drafts folder for 6 days. I opened it more than once, reread it, adjusted a sentence here or there, the way you fuss over language when some part of you is trying to talk yourself into something you are not fully certain about. I told myself 27 people's jobs were not worth the kind of war it would take to expose all of it properly. I told myself my father was tired, that he had already survived one heart attack and did not need to survive a public scandal too, that maybe he deserved something closer to peace than to the full ugly truth. I told myself that I had already spent 2 years proving something to myself, and that proving it to myself might genuinely be enough, that not everything discovered needs to be detonated, that some knowledge can simply be carried quietly for the rest of a life without ever being spoken aloud. I believed for most of that week that I was being merciful, wise even, the bigger person. Then, on the 6th night, before I finally let myself hit send, I did one more thing almost out of habit, rather than any renewed sense of purpose. I opened my own spreadsheet one final time, not to add anything new, just to look at it again with what I told myself would be clear eyes, a kind of last gut check before closing a door I understood. Even then, I would not be able to reopen once it was shut. It was not clear eyes. I recognized that almost immediately, the way you recognize your own handwriting even when you are trying to disguise it. What I was looking at on that screen was not wisdom or mercy or the bigger person making a generous choice. It was fatigue wearing wisdom's clothes, exhaustion dressed up convincingly enough that it had nearly fooled even me. I deleted the draft. I did not agonize over it a second time after that. Some decisions, once you finally see them clearly, do not require agonizing. They simply require the courage to close the browser tab and go back to waiting, which, by that point in my life, I had become better at than almost anyone I knew. The final hearing took 11 minutes, which felt like an insulting amount of time to formally end 9 years, though I have come since then to appreciate the efficiency of it. At 9:31 in the morning, the judge signed the decree. My husband did not look at me in the hallway afterward. His mother was not present at all. She considered courthouses vulgar, a luxurious opinion for a woman whose entire life's architecture had depended so heavily on exactly the kind of legal machinery she found beneath her. I walked out onto the courthouse steps into ordinary morning sunlight, stood beside a bronze statue of someone I did not recognize, and checked my watch, which I had synchronized, literally, months earlier, against the cancellation deadline taped to my apartment wall. 47 hours and change remained before the contract renewal window closed for good. They had spent 15 months betting I would go home after the decree and simply exhale, collapse into the exhaustion everyone assumed I had earned and deserved. Instead, at 9:40 that same morning, 9 minutes into being divorced, I called my father, who had been sitting by his phone since well before 7, because I had told him the week before that today would be the day. He picked up on the first ring, which told me everything I needed to know about how long he had actually been waiting. I did not ease into it. 9 minutes of freedom felt like more than enough practice for the sentence I had been rehearsing for 2 years. Dad, I said, it's done. Fire all 27, the controller has the files ready. The labor attorney has the letters drafted. Security is briefed and waiting. HR goes first, before she has a chance to touch a single personnel record on her way out. There was a pause on the line, and in it, I could hear something that felt almost audible. 34 years of you don't fire family being set down gently, like a tool that no longer fit the job it had been built for. Already got my boots on, my father said. He was 64 years old that morning, and for the length of that sentence, he sounded 20. I laughed, standing on the courthouse steps in a gray dress, newly divorced, financially leaner than I had been in a decade, holding a phone in one hand hand and 47 hours in the other, and for the first time in longer than I could easily remember, the laugh was not the kind I had to manufacture for someone else's benefit. It came up entirely on its own. I was not in the building for the firings themselves. My lawyer's last piece of advice to me, and it was good advice, was to let it be the owner's decision, executed cleanly by counsel, documented and lawful, and, above all, boring on purpose. No scenes, nothing that could later be characterized as anything other than a company correcting a serious, well-documented conflict of interest problem. But my father's controller of over 2 decades, the first person inside the building who had believed me when I first started asking careful, quiet questions, called me that evening and narrated the entire afternoon, and I am going to give it to you close to the way he gave it to me. 27 meetings, roughly 10 minutes each, conducted in a small conference room with a labor attorney and a note-taker present for everyone. Papers and folders, documented, lawful, deliberately unremarkable. No shouting, no perp walks, undisclosed conflicts of interest, related party transactions, and direct violation of policies everyone in that room had personally signed years earlier, back when I had been the woman in leadership meetings who read warranty cards for pleasure. Termination effective immediately. Here is your severance condition. Here is the door. The one who had run human resources for the company went first, before her badge could open even one more personnel file on her way out, and according to the controller, she said almost nothing at all, which chilled him more than any scene would have. Because professionals, he said, do not argue. They simply call someone else and start managing the fallout quietly. My husband's brother, the one who had turned a temporary desk into a permanent title during my father's recovery, argued. He demanded my father's loyalty first, then his gratitude, then, losing altitude with every sentence, cited his own initials on years of receiving logs as proof of his diligence, which the labor attorney apparently wrote down very slowly while he watched him do it. On his way out of the building, he kicked a trash can hard enough to dent it. By 4 in the afternoon, it was finished. 27 desks cleared. Security collected badges with the strange, careful tenderness of a hotel front desk processing a checkout. My husband, my former husband by that point, technically, by exactly 7 hours, never came into the building at all. By the time my mother-in-law showed up pounding on my apartment door that same evening, security had already walked all 27 people out of the building. Badges collected, desks cleared, the whole thing finished and filed and done by 4 o'clock that afternoon. She did not know that yet. She thought she was still early enough to stop it, still early enough to reason with me, still early enough to remind me, in my own hallway, in front of whichever neighbors happened to be walking past, what family was supposed to mean. I had never once seen her at my apartment before that evening. She would have needed to acknowledge it existed first, and acknowledging it meant acknowledging the divorce, the months I had already been living apart from her son, the whole slow unraveling of a merger she had spent nearly a decade building. But my address was in the court papers by then, and there she was through the people at 7 that evening, pearls and a wool coat despite the June warmth, fist raised against my door mid-knock when I finally opened it. I opened it because you do not get a scene like this twice in your life, and some part of me, the part that had spent 2 years documenting everything quietly, wanted to see this one with my own eyes rather than hearing it secondhand. 27 people, she said, stepping into my apartment without being asked, her voice filling the small space wall to wall before I had even fully closed the door behind her. Ungrateful, unstable, vindictive. 27 innocent people, families, mortgages, and she actually said the word Christmas in June with a straight face, as though the calendar itself owed her some deference. And what would people say? Had I thought for even 1 second about my father's reputation, hauling his own company through the mud like this, in public, where anyone could see? I stood by my bookshelf and let it break over me, which was its own strange, quiet kind of victory. 2 years earlier, that voice could have reorganized my entire nervous system in under a minute. Now it was just weather against a window, loud, but on the wrong side of the glass to actually reach me. Then, and this is the part I would have missed entirely if this had happened even a year earlier, she read the room. She recalibrated. She changed instruments mid-sentence the way only someone who has spent 40 years learning to read a room can. The volume dropped. Her chin softened. She sat down on my sofa, uninvited, smoothed the front of her coat, and became, in one seamless motion, warm. We're all tired, she said. Let me offer you something reasonable. And here it came, the same deal I had already turned down once. Dressed now in its evening gown, instead of its morning suit. Bring back the ones who were genuinely innocent. Her phrase. An admission tucked quietly inside what she was trying to make sound like kindness. Sign something. Keep it quiet. Let your father keep his good name, and you keep yours. Nobody ever has to know the rest of it. You're so good at keeping things smooth, dear. It's the best of you. There it was, my whole life handed back to me, appraised and offered as a compliment by the one person who had always seen exactly what I was made of and exactly how to use it against me. A year earlier, it might have worked. I looked at her for a long moment, and then I asked her the one question I had been saving for exactly this evening. Who signed your welcome packet? She went very still, and for 1 second, the only one I ever saw in 9 years of knowing her, she was not performing anything at all. My mother owned a flower shop, she said finally, and her voice had a kind of gravel in it I had never once heard before. When I married into this family, my father-in-law's debts were considerable. The shop was collateral nobody bothered to ask my mother about. She found out at Thanksgiving. She set the table anyway. I learned young that a woman in a family like this one is either useful or she is furniture. I have spent 40 years being useful. That is not cruelty. That is simply how the world runs. Family takes care of family. And there it was. One last time. The toast from my own wedding. The password. The entire architecture of her life compressed into 4 words. Love, in her world, had always been a supply chain. Marriage had always been procurement. Her mother's flower shop had built quietly forward through 4 decades and cashed out eventually of my father's warehouse. And she had been, at different points in her life, both the collector and once, a long time ago, the collateral herself. I felt something close to pity for her in that moment, and I want to be honest that it was real. If she had stopped talking right there, this might have ended differently between us. She did not stop talking. She stood, gathered her coat around her, and delivered what I understood, even as she said it, to be the exit line she had surely composed in the car on the way over. Sign the agreement, dear, because if this becomes public, your father's name will be a punchline at every table from here to the next county. Think carefully about what you are choosing. Then she let herself out, quiet and certain, a woman who still believed the math would eventually do her work for her, the way it always had before. I stood in my kitchen a long time after the door clicked shut behind her. Outside, the June evening was doing the thing June evenings do, holding onto the light a little longer than it needed to, and somewhere across town, 27 empty desks were sitting in the dark, and a contract renewal clock I had synchronized my own watch to months earlier was still quietly running down toward a deadline she did not yet know I had already beaten. She had come to my door believing she was still early. She had no idea, standing in my hallway with her chin lifted and her coat already buttoned for the walk back to her car, that there was nothing left anywhere in this story for her to be early for. She was not yelling because I had ruined her family. She was yelling because for the first time in 2 years, there was nothing left for her to stop.